The clouds hung low over the town, pressing down on rooftops like a thick gray quilt of sorrow. Even the birds seemed to understand the gravity of the day, their chirping absent from the early morning air. Rain threatened from the sky above, though it had yet to fall. The smell of wet earth mixed with fresh-cut flowers drifted in the wind. The air was heavy, saturated not just with humidity, but with the weight of grief. People moved slowly down the sidewalks, dressed in black and gray, their eyes downcast, their hearts burdened. This was no ordinary funeral. This was the sudden, unexpected loss of a young man, a father, a husband, a friend, a son. He had only been 32. Inside the small church nestled between rows of maple trees, the atmosphere was thick with silence. The pews were nearly full, not because he was a man of power or fame, but because he was a man of kindness, of laughter, of deep sincerity. His death had shaken the community in a way no one had anticipated. There had been no illness, no warning signs, just a late-night car crash. One moment he had been on his way home from work, likely thinking about what he'd eat for dinner or if his son had learned any new words that day. The next moment, his car had been struck by a delivery truck that lost control on a sharp curve. The collision had been catastrophic. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was pronounced dead. His wife had collapsed when she heard the news. Their son, just over 2 years old, hadn't understood what was happening. He had sat in his high chair as neighbors arrived to comfort. Her, his tiny fingers playing with a spoon, unaware of the emotional hurricane that had just swept through his home. But in the days that followed, something had shifted in the boy. He stopped laughing. He stopped playing with his favorite toy truck. He would wake up crying in the middle of the night, not screaming, not terrified, just crying. Quiet, broken. Sobs that confused even his mother, who had never heard that kind of grief from someone so small. On the morning of the funeral, she dressed him in a tiny black suit. He looked like a miniature version of the man they had lost. His curly brown hair matched his father's, as did the way he blinked slowly when tired. She buttoned up his jacket with trembling hands, her fingers pausing over each button as if sealing away a part of herself. Her own dress hung loosely on her, grief having stolen her appetite. She carried her son into the church, unsure of how she'd make it through the next hour. The coffin sat at the front, polished and quiet, surrounded by white lilies and a framed portrait of the man whose absence screamed louder than any words. His smile in that photograph was wide and genuine, the kind of smile that made people want to be around him. But that smile was now a memory, a relic of what was. The guests stood as the widow entered, then slowly sat down again as the music played softly from a nearby speaker. She chose the third row from the front, unable to sit closer, too devastated to look directly at the casket for too long. As she sat with her son on her lap, she noticed something immediately. He wasn't restless. He wasn't fidgeting like most toddlers do when forced to sit still. Instead, he was staring directly at the coffin. At first, she thought it was just curiosity. He'd never seen anything like it before. She leaned in and whispered softly, "Daddy's up there, sweetheart. He's resting now." But he didn't look at her. His gaze was locked on the wooden box, and then, very deliberately, he raised his arm and pointed. The motion was slow, deliberate, almost reverent. His tiny index finger extended forward, his elbow stiffening as if the gesture mattered in some sacred way. She followed the direction of his point and saw that it wasn't just at the coffin, it was at a very specific part of it. Just to the left of the center, about where the chest of the body inside would be. A chill ran down her spine. She pulled his hand down gently and kissed his forehead. But less than a minute later, he pointed again. Same spot, same intense stare. The people around them began to notice. One of the older women, a family friend named Mrs. Porter, leaned forward and whispered, Is he pointing at the casket? The widow nodded, unsure how to explain it. Maybe he's confused. Someone else murmured. Maybe he just wants to go up and say goodbye. But the boy didn't try to move toward the coffin. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He just kept pointing. As the priest took the pulpit and began to speak of the man's character, his contributions to the community and the life he had lived, the widow tried to keep her composure, but she couldn't ignore her son's behavior. Every few minutes he would lower his hand, blink slowly, and then raise it again, pointing with precision, never wavering, never changing direction. It was like he saw something they couldn't, like he was trying to tell them something. His mother whispered again, "Baby, what are you doing?" But he didn't answer. He simply placed his free hand over his heart, then pointed again. Her heart raced. Was it just his way of saying he missed his father? That he knew something was wrong? Or was it something else? The idea felt foolish, but it nagged at her nonetheless. Could he sense something? She looked around and saw others watching her son now, some with curiosity, others with unease. Even the priest hesitated in his speech, his eyes flicking toward the boy before continuing with the sermon. The widow held her son tighter, trying to soothe herself as much as him. But the unease was growing. The boy had never acted like this before. At home, he had gone quiet. Yes, but this was different. This wasn't just silence. This was focus, intention. As the organist began to play a soft hymn, the boy suddenly whispered a sound. Not a word, but something close. Da! He didn't say daddy or dad, just the first syllable. And then he pointed again, this time more urgently. The widow's hands began to tremble. Her breath quickened. She looked up at the coffin and then back at her son, whose expression remained unchanged. He didn't look frightened. He looked aware. That was the only word she could think of. Aware of something she couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't explain. Tears filled her eyes, not just from grief but from fear. Something wasn't right. The car ride home from the funeral was unnervingly silent. The toddler sat buckled in the car seat behind his mother, his eyes open wide, not sleepy like he usually was after long days. His small feet dangled above the edge of the seat, gently, swaying but not in rhythm, just a mindless movement. His mother, still in her funeral dress, gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale. Her thoughts were a blur of sadness and worry. The image of her son pointing over and over again at the casket haunted her. It hadn't been a child's innocent gesture. There had been intent behind it. Repetition, focus. And then there was that sound he made. Da. He hadn't said a full word, but it sounded like he was trying to speak through something he couldn't quite understand. As she pulled into the driveway of their small home, everything looked the same as it had the morning before, but everything felt different. The hedges hadn't grown an inch. The flowers in the window boxes still tilted gently in the breeze. Yet somehow, the house itself felt alien, as if the absence of her husband had changed the gravity of the space. She unbuckled her son, holding him close to her chest. He didn't resist. He just leaned his head on her shoulder and wrapped his arms tightly around her neck, like he didn't want her to ever let go. Once inside, the quiet became unbearable. There was no sound of keys being tossed into the ceramic dish by the door. No clinking of a belt being unbuckled. No soft humming of a man who often forgot he was humming. Her husband had filled their home with tiny, beautiful noises. Now it was filled with echoes. She set her son down in the living room, placing his stuffed elephant next to him. Usually he would reach for it with glee. Today, he barely noticed it. His gaze wandered to the hallway leading to the master bedroom. He stood up slowly and began walking. She followed him, her heart pounding harder with each step. He moved like he knew where he was going, not toddling in the haphazard way children his age often do, but with slow, measured steps. She reached out, ready to scoop him up before he reached the bedroom door, but he stopped right at the threshold. He stood there, staring into the dark room. The curtains were still drawn, the bed made but untouched for days. He didn't go inside. Instead, he raised his hand again and pointed, this time not at anything specific, just into the room. His mother's breath caught. She couldn't move. She stared over his shoulder, trying to see what he saw, but the room was empty. Just the scent of cologne faintly lingering in the air mixed with dust and quiet. Then, without turning around, the toddler said something. Not a word exactly, but it was clearer this time. "There," he whispered. His voice was shaky but sure. Her blood ran cold. She leaned down, gently turned him toward her, and asked, "What do you see, baby?" He didn't answer. He just looked at her, wide-eyed, and said again, "There." He pointed again, this time slightly lower, as if toward the floor near the bed. She slowly stepped into the room, her eyes scanning every inch. There was nothing there. No toy, no shadow, no strange object. Just silence. That night, sleep was impossible. Her son didn't cry like before, but he didn't sleep much either. He tossed and turned, muttering in his tiny voice, sometimes saying things that didn't make sense. Words like cold and stop and daddy home. Each phrase was like a knife to her heart. At one point, around 2 a.m., he sat straight up in bed and began pointing toward the corner of the room where the shadows thickened beyond the reach of the nightlight. He didn't speak this time. He just stared, arm outstretched, for nearly 5 minutes before he lay back down. By morning, she was running on fumes. She made him breakfast, cut strawberries, small waffles, and scrambled eggs. He usually loved it, but now he just pushed it around with his fork. She sat across from him, barely able to sip her coffee, watching him closely. "Baby," she said, softly, "can you tell Mommy what you saw yesterday? At Daddy's box?" He didn't answer. He dropped his fork and walked into the living room, climbing onto the couch and staring out the window. Later that afternoon, her sister came by. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, but she forced a small smile as she hugged her. "How are you holding up?" she asked. The widow didn't answer. Instead, she led her into the kitchen and whispered, "Something's wrong with him." Her sister raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" So she explained everything. The pointing, the whispering, the behavior at the church, the way he seemed to fixate on empty corners. Her sister tried to offer rational explanations. Grief, confusion, trauma. "He's a baby," she said. "He doesn't know how to process this. He's looking for his dad. That's what kids do." But that didn't explain the consistency, the repeated actions, the way he always pointed to the same spot at the funeral, or the way he seemed drawn to the bedroom but never entered. "It's not random," she said, her voice shaking. "It's like he's following something." Her sister grew quiet, and for a long time, neither spoke. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the orange glow filtered through the window blinds, the toddler did something different. He walked over to the fireplace mantel where several framed photos sat. One of them was of his father holding him at the beach, both of them laughing. The boy picked up the photo and stared at it for a long moment, then turned to his mother and said very clearly, "He talked to me." She froze. "What?" she whispered. He repeated it. "Daddy talked to me." He held the photo against his chest like a teddy bear and sat down on the rug. His mother dropped to her knees in front of him. "What did Daddy say?" she asked, her voice cracking. The boy didn't speak again. He just stared at her, eyes wide, lips slightly parted, as if he didn't know how to answer, or maybe he wasn't allowed to. The following morning began with heavy rain tapping against the window panes. The house felt even colder, even quieter, and for some reason, even heavier. The mother awoke not to her son crying, but to silence, unnatural silence, the kind that made her stomach twist with unease. She rushed from her room, half expecting to find him missing, but instead, he was sitting in the hallway, his small figure silhouetted against the gray light, filtering through the bathroom window. He was holding the same photograph of his father, from the mantel. It wasn't a random find. He had to climb up to get it, something he had never done before. When she asked him why he took it, he said in his small voice, "He told me to keep it close." The mother knelt in front of him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Who told you that?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He looked up at her with such earnestness, such quiet seriousness, that she didn't have to hear him say it again. But he did. "Daddy?" She didn't know what to believe anymore. At first, she thought her mind was unraveling from grief, but it wasn't. Just her own hallucinations or instability. Her child was seeing and hearing things, or worse, experiencing something real that she couldn't. Every rational part of her wanted to brush it off as trauma, but too much of it was aligning. Too many patterns. Too much repetition. There was consistency in the things he said, the places he pointed, the way he interacted with what was not visible to her. She decided to test it. That morning, she took him to the park. A change of scenery, some air, something to pull both of them out of this suffocating spiral. It was mostly empty due to the rain, but a few children were playing beneath the shelter of a covered slide area. As she placed her son down, he stood still, not moving toward the toys or the kids. Instead, he stared at a tree on the far edge of the park. "He's there," he whispered. "Who's there?" she asked, heart pounding again. He raised his hand and pointed toward the tree, just like he had at the coffin. "Daddy's there." She stood rooted for a moment, staring at the tree. There was nothing there, no one, just a gnarled old trunk slick with rain, its bark darkened, its branches reaching like arms into the stormy sky. But the way her son stared at it sent a chill through her body. That night, something new happened. She was in the kitchen washing dishes while her son played quietly in the living room. The news was on, low volume, just background noise. Then, she heard a sound that froze her hand mid-scrub, the voice of her son's toy. It was an old talking teddy bear that hadn't worked in months. Its batteries were nearly dead, and the sound had long gone distorted. But tonight, it said something that wasn't part of its programmed vocabulary. The bear's voice, crackly and slow, said, "I'm still here." She dropped the plate in the sink. Her son looked up from where he was sitting, unmoved. "Daddy talk from there," he said, pointing at the bear. The toy didn't speak again. She ripped the batteries out and shoved it into the back of the closet. That same night, her dreams were different. They weren't just of her husband, but of him standing at the foot of their bed, wet, pale, with lips slightly parted like he was trying to speak but couldn't. She jolted awake, sweating, and found her son standing in the doorway. "Did you see him too?" he asked. No 2-year-old should speak that way. Not with that clarity. Not with that weight in their voice. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The next morning, she found him again in the hallway, holding that same photo. He looked up at her, wide-eyed. "Daddy said don't let him in." She knelt beside him, trying not to show fear. "Don't let who in, baby?" He shook his head. "The other man." She didn't know what to make of that. Was it a child's invention? Something his mind was piecing together from shadows and broken dreams? Or was there something real, something darker, happening? That evening, the phone rang. It was her late husband's coworker. He wanted to drop by and return some of his belongings from the office. She agreed, thankful for some connection to her husband. When he arrived, he handed her a box of personal items, pens, a coffee mug, a photo frame. As they chatted quietly, in the living room, her son peeked from behind the hallway wall. "Is that him?" he asked. She and the coworker turned. "Him who?" she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. Her son pointed again, not at the man, but just past him, into the corner where the shadows stretched behind the coat rack. "The other man." The coworker shifted uncomfortably. "Kids say creepy stuff, huh?" She nodded, but her insides twisted into knots. After he left, she questioned her son again. "What do you mean, the other man? Is he bad?" Her son hesitated, then, in a voice barely above a whisper, said, "Daddy said he followed." "Followed?" she asked. "Followed from where?" He looked at the floor. "From the box. The coffin." Her son believed something came with her husband's body. Something else. Something not supposed to be here. She couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, too dark. Later that night, she sat in the living room alone, looking through old journals, trying to find anything her husband might have written. Maybe something that hinted at strange experiences, fears, something he kept hidden. Hours passed. Nothing unusual surfaced. Until she flipped to the back of his last notebook, the one he carried everywhere. On the last page was a scribble, not a journal entry, but a series of odd lines like he was trying to write a name or a phrase but never finished. The letters weren't clear, but they repeated VALE over and over again. Vale? It didn't make sense. Was it a name? A place? She put the notebook down and looked toward the hallway. Her son stood there again. "He's coming," he whispered. "Daddy's not strong anymore." The days that followed blurred into a haze of anxiety and sleeplessness. The mother could no longer pretend things were normal. Her world had changed, quietly and terrifyingly, since the moment her son pointed at that coffin. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was something deeper, darker, and far beyond her understanding. Every corner of her home now felt inhabited, not by people, not by memories, but by presences, unseen, silent watchers. She caught herself avoiding looking in mirrors for too long, flinching when doors creaked and keeping the hallway lights on throughout the night, no matter the power bill. Her son, however, was growing more quiet. It was like whatever he was experiencing was draining his energy. He no longer asked for cartoons, no longer giggled during play, and no longer clung to her when she carried him to bed. Instead, he spoke with the measured solemnity of someone who had seen too much. He sometimes just sat by the window for hours, watching the wind shift the trees. And he would whisper to himself, not in baby talk, not nonsense, but full sentences. Once she pressed her ear to the door to hear what he was saying. "He's coming in pieces, one part at a time," she burst in, unable to hold back the panic. "Who is coming? What do you mean?" But he wouldn't speak. He just looked at her with his wide eyes, tired beyond his years. She tried contacting a therapist, several in fact. But they all said the same thing: trauma, loss, delayed processing. "Give him time," they said. "Children grieve differently." But none of them had sat in that house. None of them had seen her son point at the exact same corner every day at 3:07 p.m. None of them had heard the scratching in the walls that came and went with the moon. One night, a storm hit. Wind whipped the house, and the rain beat so hard against the windows that it sounded like someone was trying to break in. The lights flickered. She grabbed her son and took him into her bed. He didn't resist. He curled up beside her, silent as always. But as she was about to doze off, he leaned close to her ear and said, "He wants me to go." She shot upright. "Who? Who wants you to go?" His answer was barely a whisper. "Daddy said I can't. He's holding him back." That night, she dreamed again. but it was unlike any dream she'd had before. She was in the funeral home, standing by the closed coffin, but it was shaking, ever so slightly. She tried to open it, but her hands wouldn't move. Then she saw her son standing behind her, and when she turned back to the coffin, the lid had cracked open. Inside wasn't her husband. It was something else. A figure too tall, too dark, its face a blur. It whispered her name, and she woke up screaming. From that day, she started documenting everything. She set up cameras in the house, bought voice recorders, began writing in her own journal obsessively. She wanted proof, something tangible to hold on to. But every time something strange happened, the recordings would corrupt. Videos would skip. Audio would distort. And yet, her son continued to point. He began drawing, too, scribbled shapes of coffins, of tall, dark men without faces, of her, always her, standing alone in rooms filled with shadows. Then, one afternoon, while cleaning the attic, she found a sealed envelope among her husband's things. The handwriting was his. Her name was written on the front, but she'd never seen it before. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter, dated just 2 weeks before his death. The contents chilled her to the bone. It read, "If something happens to me, you must not trust the silence. It watches. It listens. I've been followed. I don't know what it is, but I see it in dreams, in reflections, in our son's eyes. He sees it too. I tried to protect him, but I fear it's too late. It came through something I touched. Something ancient, cursed maybe. The coffin won't hold it. If he ever starts pointing, it means the barrier is breaking. Don't let him follow it." She sat there, unable to breathe. Her husband had known. Long before his death, he had sensed it. This wasn't just grief or imagination. This was something real. That evening, she packed a bag. She took her son and left the house. No destination in mind, no family to go to, just the instinct to run. They checked into a motel on the outskirts of town. Cheap, dimly lit, but distant. Enough. She thought distance might dilute whatever was haunting them. But that night, her son woke up screaming. She ran to his bed, heart racing, and found him thrashing violently, his tiny fists punching the air. "Let me go!" he shouted. "Let me go." She held him close, rocking him, whispering to him, praying this nightmare would end. And then he said it again. He's not holding him back anymore. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. She watched the room, eyes fixed on every shadow, every flicker of the motel lights. The next day, she took her son to a priest, not out of religious faith. She had never been particularly devout, but out of desperation. The priest, an older man with a weathered face and tired eyes, listened patiently as she poured out everything. To her surprise, he didn't mock her. He didn't laugh. He didn't call her crazy. Instead, he said, "You're not the first to say these things." She asked him what he meant. "There have been stories," he said, "of spirits that don't pass on, of guardians that stay behind, protecting the ones they love from darker things. But guardians don't last forever. If your husband was keeping something at bay, then his strength is tied to your memory of him, your son's connection to him. If that fades, so does the barrier." She clutched her son tighter. "Can you help us?" she asked. He paused. "I can try." He gave them holy water, a blessed cross, and a prayer to recite. But when they returned to the motel, they found the door ajar. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. But on the wall above the bed was a smear, a handprint, impossibly large, made of something dark and sticky, like ash and tar. Her son looked up at her. "He's inside now." That night, they recited the prayer, again and again. Her son repeated it with her, word for word, though he could barely pronounce some of the syllables. And just when they reached the end, the lights went out. In the darkness, she heard it. Breathing. Not hers. Not her son's. Something else. She didn't move. Neither did he. And then, from the other end of the room, came the unmistakable sound of something dragging itself across the floor. She lit a candle. The flame flickered violently, but in its dim glow there was nothing, no one. But the smell, burnt wood and decay, filled the room like a cloud. Her son whispered, "It wants to be me now." She didn't understand. "What do you mean, baby?" "It wants to go into me," he said, eyes wide, unmoving. "Daddy said no, but Daddy is fading." She broke down in tears. How could she fight this? How could any mother fight something she couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't even name? But then she remembered something the priest said. Memory is power. She gathered every photo she had of her husband, every letter, every shirt that still carried his scent. She made a circle of them around the bed, held her son close, and began to speak. She told her son stories of his father, how he proposed, how he laughed, how he danced in the kitchen with him in his arms. Her son began to smile. He began to laugh. And then something screamed. Not human, not animal. It came from the shadows of the room, a terrible, distorted wail. The candle blew out, but in the darkness, she saw something, just for a second. Her husband standing between them and a figure cloaked in blackness. He was light. The figure was void. They clashed without. Sound without motion, like two forces of nature colliding. Then silence. She passed out. When she awoke, the sun was rising. Her son was asleep beside her peacefully, his small fingers clutching her shirt. The circle of memories was scorched at the edges, as if fire had tried to invade, but failed. They left the motel that morning. They didn't return home. They moved to another city. New job, new apartment. They started over, but she kept the circle. Every night she told her son a story about his father. Every morning they said, "We remember you." And as the years passed, the pointing stopped. But every now and then, at exactly 3:07 p.m., her son would pause, glance at the wall, and smile. "He's still watching," he'd say, just in case. And she would smile too, because deep down, she believed it.